Hello and welcome to the panel at Dublin BIC. Today is Thursday, the 2nd of July, and I'm delighted to welcome here today to the panel Fergal McGovern, founder and CEO of Visible Thread. Fergal, you have been an eyewitness at some of the, I would say, key moments in Irish software history as an executive with Iona Technologies, with Evian, and more recently as a founder and CEO of SteelTrace, and now founder and CEO of Visible Thread. So I'm absolutely delighted to have you on the panel. To begin, could you begin by telling us about your current enterprise, Visible Thread?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Martin, and good to be chatting with you today. So Visible Thread is a language analysis platform, so it's software, and it's normally used for two specific jobs. The first job is to look at kind of complex content, PDF, Word docs. And if we look at our customer base in that context, people like Boeing Corporation, Lockheed Martin, lots of defense and aerospace customers in that space are using our solutions to basically make the process of reviewing content more efficient, up to 85% more efficient in certain use cases, and also more compliant and better quality outcomes. So that drives directly the top line. So it improves being more compliant in a large pursuit, a proposal pursuit, means that the probability of winning is higher, and that leads to the top line improvement that you get in the business. So that's one kind of type of customer that we have. The second type of customer is a broader type. These are people like the Australian government. The Department of Health, for instance, in Australia is a user of our solutions. And these are teams of people in the likes of the Australian government or Sun Life, which is a very large insurance organization. They're using our platform to test and score content before it goes out the door. This content is typically, even a compliance notice that you might receive from, Revenue or the IRS in the US, typically written by non-professional writers. Typically, these people know all about the subject that they're writing about. But in many cases, the content they're writing is internal focused and isn't really engaging with the user or the reader. And what that does basically is two things. It drives friction between the entity issuing the content. And if I send you a very complex compliance notice, you'll probably not engage. And if you do engage, you'll cost me money by picking up the phone and getting through to my contact center, and that increases friction and costs. So we've seen stats, for instance, in Sun Life, where they've actually reduced the amount of call center traffic and contact center traffic by up to 19%, just by making more accessible, clear, engaging content. So they're the two kind of types of customers we have.
Very good. And just to put that first customer into context, I know you gave me an example earlier of one of these huge defense contractors. They might be responding to a 500-page RFP document, and they could be knocked out of the competition if they miss some compliance requirement on page 187. But your software can assure for them that they do not miss that piece.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great example. The problem with when you have teams of people doing certain activities that are important to a business, the problem is people, actually. It's both a great thing and it's a bad thing. So if you're dealing with lots of content, with lots of moving parts, with lots of different people overseeing things, even if you think about a funding round, that's a similar type of problem space. You're going to potentially miss stuff. And the consequence of missing something in a very materially large pursuit or contract engagement, be it a prime contractor with a subcontractor, or be it with the prime contractor and the US government, for instance, the consequences are quite profound. They're quite material to the business. So those sales teams basically manually review this stuff. And maybe it's late in the day. Maybe I miss, that little requirement on page 502, or maybe I miss the annex, which talks about what is referred to in that vernacular as flow down clauses. These are clauses that are, around intellectual property or cybersecurity. And I missed that. I didn't pick it up, and I submit a non-compliant proposal. That is a serious consequence, and has a very dramatic consequence to the top line for these organizations.
What direction is all of this going? You're saying at the moment that your software might make it 85% more efficient in
Sure.
order to review one of these documents. Are we moving towards a situation where your software will make it 100% more efficient and the human will be removed from the equation?
Not at all. I'm a little bit older and wiser these days than perhaps I used to be, and still learning, which is good. Look, software and automation and productivity solutions are about productivity. They're about doing things that human beings are less good at, freeing human beings to do the thinking, the thoughtful process. It's, you know, we sometimes get the question, well, can your software automatically rewrite a certain piece of copy? That's a bogus argument. It doesn't stand up. Google are trying a lot of artificial intelligence and various other, you know, deep research, not just Google, IBM are at the same stuff. The time in which some software will write the next Ulysses is not in my lifetime.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Do you see the fake news and the marketing BS and the jargon? Is that situation improving or getting worse?
It's a good question, but it's probably an area that we don't actively play in. So when you think about language analysis, you can apply that, and it's probably a useful lesson, a salutary lesson for anybody who's going on the journey of a startup and kind of creating something that they think will be of value. What do I mean by that? You'll often get guidance and advice, particularly in the early stages of any company doing something like language analysis, which is, hey, you could use this for, you know, listening in on kind of the Twitter feeds and doing kind of what people often refer to as sentiment analysis, you know, kind of which way is this sentiment for a particular community, thinking about, you know, negative inferences, positive inferences. There's a long way to go in that whole area of sentiment analysis from a natural language processing standpoint. But from a fake news standpoint, we don't particularly apply ourselves to that area. It's not an area that we find that interesting. It's a crowded space, and we're not kind of looking at that as a company. We're much more for the organization that is serious about the interactions that they're having with their cohort of customers, and kind of, you know, that could be typically in a B2B or a B2C context. But you can't really, I don't believe, technically, the state of the art is at a place where you can reliably detect fake news through automation or algorithmic mechanisms. I think there's still a lot of work and development required in that. And it's generally in the area of sentiment analysis, and there's a lot of interesting work going on there, but it's still a ways to go.
Okay, I'd like to go on to another subject with you, Fergal, which is, you mentioned that your clients include Boeing and these very large defense contractors. Can we talk about selling into those very large organizations? Because I know from working with many startup enterprises that particularly for the most innovative of them, that they can be quite shocked and stunned at a very early stage in their development to have an opportunity to pitch into these very large organizations, and are rather overawed by it, and sometimes get lost along that journey. Can you tell us about how to successfully sell into such a large organization, and what does the very small organization need to do in order to prepare itself for that?
Sure. It's a huge question, and there's a lot of, I suppose, learnings and lessons that I've had over the years, and believe me, still learning. Not everything is going to be perfect. So I think what differentiates the person who's going to succeed in that kind of sales cycle versus the one who won't is the ability to listen well and pick up signals well from the customer community that you think you're going to apply your wares to. So we're at a slightly different stage these days in the context of Visible Thread. We have a clear playbook. We have a clear pattern of selling. We've got a clear set of metrics that help us understand success or failure as we scale our organization. But during the early days, so for instance, how did I even get into Boeing or Lockheed or Northrop Grumman or any of these defense and aerospace areas? We had a thesis back in 2011, 2012 that our product could be applied in that context. But of course, how do you validate that? You've got to go into the market. You've got to get on a plane. Of course, these days that's tricky, but you've got to kind of identify a sufficiently tight and small community where you can test your proposition. It's not an MVP. I mean, you know, minimum viable product is product centric. It's inward facing in some respects. It's a valid point to do, but you're almost saying, okay, I've got this proposition. I need to speak about it in the context of the language of the customer. So in our case, in 2011, 2012, I had a conversation with an individual based on the East Coast of the US that was tied in with my own kind of network, who said, wow, that's really interesting what you're doing, Fergal. You know, we do this by hand in the context of large scale proposals. And we create what's known as a compliance matrix in that context. I said, oh, that's very interesting. What's a compliance matrix? Help me understand what that is. Well, we start by shredding, quote unquote, shredding the document. That means slicing it into its pieces. We then assemble that into an Excel spreadsheet. We then put in columns in the spreadsheet saying, well, there's a requirement. Who's going to do that? Are we compliant? Are we not? And then after about 2 days, we send that out to the team and they manually review it. And then they say, well, we've got a problem here, we've got a problem there. And there's probably 50 to 100 people reviewing this. So I'm thinking, that's interesting. And then you start to map to that problem space. So you're selling the solution to that problem rather than, hey, I've got a product that actually shreds or slices a doc, and it will allow you to collaborate and do all this other stuff, which, you know, it's a difference of perspective. So I would always counsel, find your community, understand their language, and link to that language. If you don't do that, you'll probably fail. Then the question is, how do you do that in the context of a large organization? Well, the first thing that people need to understand is that there's a lot more involved in a larger, it has the characteristics of an enterprise sales cycle without the dollar value of an enterprise sales cycle. So these days, nobody is buying software for $1 million or $2 million. Yes, they are eventually, but when you're starting in your early part of your journey, you're probably going to maybe get 10, 20, 30 grand out of a company. It might take you 12 to 18 months. So you've got to have the balance sheet that will actually support that. And you've got to have the listening prowess to very quickly adapt your message during that selling cycle. So the very early selling cycle, you know, what differentiates you is you. What were people buying? They were buying me as much as they were buying a product. They were buying credibility. They're buying intelligence or whatever I exhibit. Presumably one is intelligent. But you're looking to kind of wedge into an organization that isn't used to fast pace. You're looking to get into an organization, and I think most people who've never dealt with the enterprise, which is probably a lot of people out there. I was fortunate the early part of my career was in the US, where I was actually working within a large enterprise. So I saw it from the other side. The bureaucracy, the paperwork, the procurement cycle, the IT vetting, all of this can add 4 or 6 months easily to a cycle, even a small dollar cycle. But you've got to get the small dollar cycles. That gets you credibility. And the one thing that we did in those early days is that we went to an in-person event for a very specific niche targeted set of people. These were called proposal management, more than we could afford. Our best foot and testing for 3 years. What was interesting, it turned out that at the end, that we were 7 customers that directly came from that. And those customers included Northrop and Iron Mountain. So we took a gamble, got in a plane, went to the market, fed back the learnings from the market, and actually glossed up our product to speak in that language. So for instance, you'd see a button in our product which says parse the doc. So the language really matters, the positioning really matters, particularly if you're actually targeting certain communities.
Very good. I just want to come back to that extraordinary example you gave there of the customer telling you that they took a very large document and parsed it into cells on an Excel spreadsheet and went through it, which is fairly shocking that anybody should do that. But more importantly, what I'm hearing back from that is that rather than you going to that customer with a soup to nuts solution, which you could have easily done, the kernel of the solution actually came from them. And then when you were going back with your solution, you were feeding back to them something that was in one way extraordinarily familiar to them and that they could easily get on board with. which is a superb learning for many startups, because much more commonly what happens is they go with the complete solution straight off. How many people are Visible Thread now?
We're about 30 and a bunch of auxiliary people. So for instance, we have a distributor in Australia and we have a number of independent sales reps that work with us as well. But the core team is about 30.
So what's the difference between being an early startup, you know, with yourself and one or two people, to being an organization with 30 plus partners?
Sure. I think the difference is stage and scrappiness. So in the early days, it's a little like the Groupon guys. You know, they went around Chicago on bicycles and, you know, hand printed coupons, and that was very appropriate and very right to test the proposition. I think in the context of the very early days, what you start out with is a germ of an idea. Certainly I do anyway. I have an issue that's typically close to my heart. I'm trying to solve that. And then I'm looking at, okay, well, this seems like a pretty good idea, but I know that the market, I'm not clear on whether the market will accept that idea. So you go out there and you're listening and learning all the time. So you always start out with something, well, I think that will solve this problem. It will do it very well. And then sometimes the market, of course, is a cruel bedfellow, and it'll help you understand that actually you were dead wrong in certain areas and you're dead right in other areas, or maybe you're half right. And your ability to process that and to very quickly iterate on that is key. That's what you do all the time in the early days. And you're also selling. I mean, as a CEO, as a founder, your primary job is to sell some vision. You've got nothing else in your armory. I mean, that's what you're selling. You're selling passion, you're selling a vision. So you're kind of evangelical, at least for me. And that conviction sells, particularly in the US market, where people like and trust people that they like and trust. So you're selling that. Now, different markets have different characteristics, but probably a different topic. The difference then when you progress, once you find that kind of, people talk about product market fit a lot, right? But it's a little more subtle than that, I think. The problem with product market fit as a concept, it's a good concept, but actually there's a next stage, which is, and Mark Roberge, of former HubSpot founder, or not founder, but COO, talks very well about this. There's the go-to market fit. So if you get your product market fit and you've got your 10 or 100 users and they're using it every day and that's all good, and maybe you bring on one or two salespeople and that's all good too. The types of salespeople you get in the very early stages are very different from the types of salespeople you get in later stages. You effectively need good listeners, which is not a given with salespeople. So you need to choose carefully who you get on the sales side. But once you get that product market fit, you basically don't scale immediately. You now go to this go-to market fit. And again, I'm stealing Roberge's kind of thesis and his framework, but it's a very useful framework. And it articulates a flow that I found to be really true. You'll get counsel by investors and elsewhere. You know, you go to board meetings and say, well, you just did Standard Life of South Africa, which was one of our early deals. In fact, we did it completely remotely. Let's double down on banking. Let's double down on this, and let's hire in our guys. And it's Excel math. It's, you know, we'll throw in 3 sales guys, and each one will contribute net new, 500K or 800K per annum, and off you go. It never works because you're still in this go-to market fit stage, and you're still in the unit economic stage. You're still trying to say, well, actually, yeah, truly, are we measuring the performance of this 1 or 2 reps? So you kind of move from this test narrative. Yes, we're seeing to locking in on certain things. So the shred and the compliance matrix, you understand the language. You're now putting out white papers on this stuff. You're testing. And now you're beginning very early scaling, but you still have got to go through this messy stage. So right now we're kind of at the back end of the messy stage. We're in the early stage of kind of the actual scale stage. So it's tremendously exciting for us, but certainly in Steel Trace, my former company, we probably were still at the middle of the messy stage, and then we got acquired, and that was a nice outcome for various people. But what's more interesting about Visible Thread is that now we're into the potential scale stage, which is a different learning, and then you have to shift the deck chairs a bit and make sure you've got the right capability in the exec team and elsewhere to actually support that next stage of expansion.
Sorry, Fergal, I could talk to you all day on the subjects we've covered, selling into those large corporations and what you need to do that. And as you go from startup phase into scaling, the kind of changes that happen in your organization to facilitate that happening. Perhaps we'll have to have you to come back, Fergal, to talk on some of those other topics that you touched on upon there. But thank you very much for your time, Fergal McGovern, CEO and founder of Visible Thread.
Thank you, Martin.